Recording. Okay, so first let's cover some of those basic troubleshooting related questions that we were just talking about from basically that came up from the reviews. So I'm just going to I'm in Rhino. If you guys want to follow along, I encourage it. We're just going to make a couple shapes here in Rhino kind of from scratch. I'm in inches, large units inches if you want to use that template. All right, so I'm going to change my perspective view to shaded. I'm going to build a couple. I'm going to turn my O snaps on. It looks like none of my presets were saved on this guy, so. All right, I just want to make a sequence of shapes that we can understand when we cut through it that different things are happening, basically. So what I might do is just make something that has a little bit of volumetric interest to it. Maybe there's, you know, an L-shaped corner or a little extrusion. The way that I did that just now, if we haven't covered that previously, was Boolean difference. So I have this. We did this when we were doing the Barcelona Pavilion exercise and making steps in one of the earliest classes, but just as a rehash. I built a rectangular salad. I made another shape that I wanted to basically pull out of that salad. So I'll just show it again here. I want to remove basically where this shape, the space that this shape is taking up within this shape. So I can select this shape and type Boolean difference. And then select that second shape as the subtractor volume. And then it will remove that from my original volume. So basically delete that first shape I made. So I can just get an object that has some interesting edges to it. I'm going to turn off my ISO curves just so it's a little easier to read. Let's also I might have one on here from previous weeks. No, I guess for now it's fine. I'm just going to draw just a quick topography, like I think we had looked at previously. I'm just using a multiple point curve, moving those things around in space so that we'll have a little bit of a sloped area. If there's a question about, let me use my C-planes to kind of readjust where certain pieces of the geometry are in the scene. Again, I think we've looked at all these items in class before, and they've been posted on the videos, so I'm not going to dwell on any one of these commands for too long. I'm going to loft these two lines so that we have this kind of sloped surface. And then we could even extrude this down if we want to so that we have some sort of base. So we can flatten it out with, because it's not flat. We can use the trim command or the split command. I want to split this object with this line that I made. Oh, it looks like it didn't use it because of the back here. I'll try this one more time. I should be able to split these surfaces with this object here. Looks like I was able to do so, that's good. If I wanted to, then I could recombine these, join them, and then I could cap this object. Make sure that all those surfaces are joined. I could cap this object on the bottom. All right, so I have a little kind of a weird object in the landscape. I could make sure that the edges of how it's sitting in the landscape is important from a drawing standpoint. So let's say I want to make sure that this line actually reads when I make a drawing out of it. So I'm going to actually split this object using this face, so that basically I can just delete everything that's below. Sometimes in Make 2D, if you had any objects within your landscape or interfacing with another object, as we looked at when we were doing some of the Barcelona Pavilion modeling, if those planes or surfaces run through an object, but it doesn't cleanly meet up, that line work won't show up in a Make 2D. So you'll get you wouldn't be able to see where the edge of this actually would read if you didn't split it or register somehow how this edge meets the surface of this landscape here. So just to be a little bit more organized here in my layers, I'm just going to say site. I'm going to make a site layer. We'll make that a greenish color. Put this on the site layer. And then we'll put this little object on another layer we make. We'll just say intervention. Make that reddish, brownish. Okay. All right, so we have some baseline for some drawing operations on this. So a couple things I could do before I were to be producing any sort of drawings from this, any of the kind of guiding curves or lines that I use to extrude these surfaces that you can see here when I hover over certain areas. I can just get rid of that stuff. When I make drawings of this, that's just going to be doubled up line work that is just more confusing for workflow and cleanliness of the drawing later. So in general, like if I know that I've gotten this to the point that I want, to produce just drawings off of this, try to clean up the guiding lines that you were using to construct it, or you can put those on their own layer and hide that. All right, so right now we're in perspective view. I want to create a few views of this. And again, I covered this in that video from last week, so I encourage you to look at that after the class if you're still kind of struggling with it. But basically, I can set views of my own choosing in plan or in section or in perspective in Rhino. So let's say I want to return to this view often to show different things happening on this part of the site. So I could go to my perspective, right-click, and go to Set View. And then within the Set View, at the bottom of the Set View subpanel is a Named Views, ... That will bring up its own menu, Rhinoceros Named Views. So I could then now say, all right, I want to save the view that you see on the screen right now. I want to save this as, I'm going to call it P1, let's say, because perspective view 1, fine. We'll say OK, and then that will show up in this named view panel. So now if I were to go, let's say I then rotate around the scene, I could save a couple other views here. Let's say I want this view where it's a little bit lower down. OK, I could say then, let's save this view now, P2. And then I'll do one, maybe that's kind of from the other side. Just similar angle from the other side, though. I'll do named view P3. Okay. So now, say I'm elsewhere in the model. I'm in another view. I want to get back to one of these views. I could either, with the named view panel on, I could double-click one of these views, and it will take me through these areas very quickly, just double-clicking those. Or, even cooler, I could just type the name of the view into the command line, and it's automatically hotkeyed. So as long as you don't have spaces in your view, or that the view name doesn't share a name with a pre-existing command in Rhino that already has a hotkey attached to it, you can just keyboard cycle through the view. So I could just go up to my command line and type P1, and it will take me back to that. I could say then P2, P3, and then very, very quickly cycle through the views, which is nice. Another thing I can do in 3D here, say I wanted the drawing to be a little bit more kind of analytically robust. So perspective view obviously is nice experientially, but of course there's no ability to measure things accurately off of that drawing once you've exported it into say a scaled, you're attempting to scale something or dimension something. unless you've annotated it in the perspective drawing itself. You wouldn't be able to print that drawing and then say, oh, I can accurately tell that this side is here because there's foreshortening, right? So that's where the axonometric, a parallel projection view would come into play. So you could go to, this may not be listed at, actually this may be on your computers. Isometric might be an option in your set views. I'm hopeful that it is. Actually, that's great if it is. We used to have to create these angles ourselves. But if you do have isometric, does everyone have it? Okay. Let's choose the northeast isometric view. And then, so what that has done is that has changed the projection of the image, right? And we have talked about this before, and I'm hopeful that this has been talked about a little bit in other classes, but a parallel projection allows you to measure accurately a drawing that is, say, showing something in 3D, similar to the way that you can measure accurately a plan or a section or an elevation. So I could print this drawing, and if I know the scale of the drawing in relation to the other drawings that I've made, I could tell that this line is never foreshortened. It's always the same distance. It's always the same length, no matter where I am in the scene. Basically, the combination of it, the way that the camera sets this up, it lets everything stay the actual distance that it's supposed to be. So it's a measurable drawing, which can be very useful. So let's say I have my measurable drawing that's in 3D. We'll call this not P1, but let's call it A1 as in an axonometric. A1. Okay, so that's there. So let's say now that I want to take some sections of this model, and so a couple ways that we can do this. So clipping plane, which again is covered in that video, but we'll rehash it here real quick. Clipping plane is its own command. And what you'll notice here with the clipping plane is as soon as if I were to type it and I have my C-plane as kind of the world default, which is horizontal like this, when I try to create my C-plane, it's going to create it as a flat plane, just like it would build any other object when the C-plane is at that setting. So if I click the other side here, now there's a object that has a direction, the direction of this line here. I can flip the object to point the other way, but you'll notice what it's doing is it's slicing or appearing to slice the objects in the scene where the C-plane is located. So I could, if I were to go into my 4 view here, so you'll also notice the C-plane is only operating it's only cutting, quote unquote, in the A1 view, because you'll notice on the right side, the only view that it's saying C-plane is active in is A1. I could have it be active in my top view, my front view, or my right view if I wanted to, so that all these look the same. Sometimes, though, what's nice is being able to make some analytical cuts in your model in one view, but see where the leftover stuff is in the other views. So again, clipping plane is a filter. It's not actually deleting the information. So if I were to be in my front view, say, and I'm just dragging my C-plane down, you can see in the A1 view that the model information comes back. So it's in real time giving you kind of an indication of where you are in that in the clip. So say then I were to, and that's where if I flip it, right now it's pointing up. So it's cutting everything. It's basically cutting from the bottom up. So everything above this line you can see. That's where this the view line basically comes into play. Everything below that line is cut away. So if I flip this, the opposite occurs. Oops. Right? So basically everything now below my view of the C-plane is cut away. And if I were to go back to my cut view here and drag this up, you can see the sort of analysis of cut that happens, right? So you can also do this you can make multiple C-planes and have them operating at the same time. Let's just put these on their own layer real quick. Clipping plane. Sorry, not C-plane, clipping plane. C-plane is our construction plane. Let's be clear about that. So clipping plane, let's put this on. So you'll notice here, if I were to go to my properties to change the layer of my clipping plane, it has its own clipping plane menu that shows up. So if you just need to get back to your properties, you just go back over to object. And then that's where that normal properties menu readout will be listed. So I'm just going to change that to clipping plane. So now I can turn that off or on. You'll notice as well, though, when I turn this layer off, it doesn't actually deactivate the clipping plane. Unlike hiding objects that we had done before when we had layer management sessions, when you hide an object, it goes away, it's out of view. The clipping plane is away from view, but it's still active. So the way you can deactivate a clipping plane by just saying disable clipping plane. And then that will, it keeps the clipping plane in the model so that you can re-enable it by just typing enable, right? But it lets you, say after you've done your analysis, you can hide it or move it out of the way so that it's not interrupting other drawing operations that you want to do. So let's say I wanted to make another clipping plane. I'll just be on my clipping plane layer here. So that's deactivated, but say I want to do one that's actually going to be cutting sectional views. Type clipping plane. So in this case, same way. And notice too that the clipping plane itself doesn't need to be touching the object. Like I could have this way down here, and it's an infinite plane. This is just an implication of where it is so that you can control it without it being unwieldy. So it doesn't need to be touching the model. Like if it's visually hard to understand or confusing to see this overlaid on the model, you can just move it out of the way and it will still work. So in this case, I have this clipping plane that's kind of running vertical. So if I change my C-plane back to horizontal and I slide this around, I can then get a sort of vertical section cuts of my model, right? I could also rotate this thing if I wanted to do kind of transverse, rotate. To rotate this thing, I want to do kind of transverse cuts of the model itself, right? So you can really start to break down this model in as many slices as you want. So, yeah, question?
How'd you make it vertical again?
So when I'm drawing the plane itself, well, so once it's in the object, once it's in the scene, you can rotate it, move it around, just like you could any other object. So once I've created this plane, for example, I could just click Rotate 3D and then choose it should have clipping points along it. Choose an axis, and then it will ask me to flip it. So I can do it that way. Or when I draw the plane itself, I'm just a little bit more methodical with it, and I change my C-plane orientation before I do it. So right now, if I were to draw a C-plane, or a clipping plane rather, the construction plane is horizontal, so it's going to draw one like this. But if I change my construction plane to be this orientation or this orientation, and then I say clipping plane, then it will draw it automatically. It will draw it vertically. And that's actually I would suggest you do it that way, unless there's a weird angle, a particularly weird angle that you want to get the plane to be. You can obviously manipulate it like we just looked at in 3D space once you've made the plane itself. So if I wanted to, I could enable this plane again, this other one, and then actually it's cutting in both ways. So I'm just moving my construction plane back to horizontal so I can slide these around in an easy way. This guy, obviously, I probably want to be operating these in these other views so it's easier to move them without changing the construction plane. But so I can have both those active. Obviously, if I want to just use one of them, just disable one, or I can disable both. And then we're back to what we had before. You had a question?
When you clip or the section as you did, and you want to say that you do it in the layers area, or that view that you just clipped, that section?
So the view that you clipped, so the clipping of the view itself, we still have to extract line work from that, or a screenshot or something. Say if you wanted a screenshot of that view, in lieu of line work, we'll look at that now. So I'm just going to go ahead and delete one of these so that we're just dealing with a little bit simpler of a situation. And just so that it's very clear where this is going, I'm actually going to put him on the model again. So let's make sure he's enabled. And actually, before I do that, let's just make sure that everybody understands the normal process of making 2D. So I think we generally, it sounded like we all do, but we'll do it once more. Say I'm in A1 view. I just typed A1 into the command line. The make 2D function will basically extract line work in the view orientation that is on your screen of any objects that you select. So I could select everything right now and say make 2D. It brings up a series of submenus that allow me to say, all right, yes, I want this to be the current view. I don't want it to be the view of these other plans or sections. I don't want those right now. I just want this view. I want this this selection of objects to be drawn. And then I can also choose, if I wanted to show hidden lines. So say there were, say you did want to see like the back lines that are out of sight of the object to better understand like how it sits in the scene. You could say show hidden lines, and that will create a separate layer of line work. You can also, this can be exported, kind of like when we were making Illustrator work last week. You can toggle how that line work translates across different layers. So I could say, all right, when I make 2D of this, I can maintain source layers, and then that will redraw the line work for this with the topography on green and the site intervention on brown, or I can not say that, and it will just be make 2D line layer that happens. So we can do it both ways real quick. So we'll just say we don't do anything in here, but just say OK, just use the defaults. And what gets created is a flat projection of the work that was there. So if we go back to our top view, basically that line work for make 2D from our A1 view is captured. And so I can then, just like with everything else in this in Rhino, it's live geometry. I can edit the line work. I could go in and I could add line work. I can draw over this in Rhino, additional items if I wanted to. Say I went back to my model. I could keep this off to the side. And notice that it's in its own make 2D layer, right? So I can turn that off and on if I need to. But say I went back to my model and I decided, oh, you know what? I want to add some element to this, and then I want to basically match the layer of the intervention. So now I go back and say, oh, well, actually, I want that object to be in the make 2D that I made. I could since this isn't that complicated of a make 2D, I could just redo the whole thing. But say you've made a 2D drawing, you've worked on it, you've added other layers to it, in plan, and then you realize you want to add some additional layer of work to the drawing itself. So I could just select this object and say make 2D just of that object. And then it will at scale make just that object. So then I could take that object, knowing that it's in the axon projection, and just move it over to the drawing that I already made. So I can start to compile multiple pieces of drawings together. If I want to extract different elements or highlight those elements in a different way, say I wanted that to be on its own layer, I could extract that and turn it to a different color, make it a different layer if I wanted to. Okay, so I'm just gonna we can leave this in the scene for a second. So as you might guess, if I were to do, let's make sure I'm in A1 view, so it's the same. Do a make 2D, and then when this object screen comes up, we can say maintain source layers and maybe show hidden lines. Say OK. Now there's some slightly different line work going on. Just going to move this over. So you can see that the white lines are representative of the make 2D hidden lines. And in our layers folder, or in our layers menu rather, there's a visible and there's a hidden subset of lines. So all of the hidden lines there's no layer beyond just the hidden lines layer, so they're all white, just showing any back face of any of the objects. So once we move this drawing to Illustrator, we could make those lines dotted or change the line weight of them altogether to something really light so that the hierarchy of it reads better. Or we can, maybe we realize, you know what, these dotted lines are not, or these hidden lines are not helping the analysis of this drawing, I'll just turn them off. So in this case now you can see we have our line work is associated with the proper layers that we modeled it on, which again I think can be useful for management once we're in Illustrator. So let's keep those drawings up. Let's turn our clipping plane back on. We'll enable the clipping plane. And let's move our clipping plane towards maybe this area of this model here, so there's some some interest visually in the breakdown of the shapes. Okay, so now I can go back to my A1 view, say, and, oh, this is another thing. It will be, we want to make sure that it's enabled in that view. So as we saw earlier, I'll type A1, clipping plane suddenly is not on. We can go here and make sure that it says, okay, no, it's, so say you were in perspective view or you're out here. You're not actually in your A1 view right now, even though it says you are. A1 view is very specific to that. So as soon as I'm clicking around, or if I happen to change views, if the clipping plane suddenly isn't working, just check on your model views and just make sure that it's clicked on for the finalized view that you decide. So now with my clipping plane turned on, I can go back in, and you'll notice that it's a little more difficult to select these objects, because actually what is here is my left to right click selection that we use when we want to only select objects that are fully within that shape. It's still registering that these shapes exist, and so the invisible part of the shape still technically would need to get dragged over for me to select it. So that's why it's actually not letting me select this one, because I'm clearly not seeing the edge of this. So I just use my right to left click, make sure that you've selected all the objects. And again, you can see that not everything was selected. So it's just good to double check that everything was selected with the clipping plane. So now if I type make 2D, additional options are here. Visible clipping plane option, hidden clipping plane option. So in this particular case, I could say, it's saying, okay, I understand that you've filtered a cut of your model here, and you want, even though the line work doesn't register, it's not a real cut, we can mimic that it is using the clipping plane extraction. So let's say okay. And then when we go back to the top view, we have a cut in our model. So it's a cut that is in line, basically, with where the clipping plane cut was, right? So, and then we can go in here and say, oh, you know, if I'm going to make a section of this, a sectional view of this, and add some line work or hatches or something to it later, you know, maybe I don't want to see that this is hollow inside, because actually I want it to appear solid. So you can go in and start to edit some of the objects that are there so that it reads a little bit more cleanly before you export it to Illustrator. You can also obviously delete that line work in Illustrator if you want to. We can start to set up some datum lines for kind of drawing export production, knowing that this is a measurable drawing because it's parallel projection. Let's say we have this, just a guide here. These are aligned. This one looks like it got shifted down for whatever reason, but we can just make sure that that corner lines up so that we know that it's basically been cut at this point. It's just a drawing cleanliness standpoint. This is not a requirement. It's just good organization. So we can continue to go in here. I could take a few more clipping plane sections. One thing to note is obviously when I move my clipping plane, unless I undo, I can't accurately get back to that exact clipping plane cut unless I'm making another series of marks or reference points. So one way to do this that is fairly straightforward, you can just, on the clipping plane layer, you can just draw a series of hatch marks that basically represent where, you know, clipping plane 1 was. Then when we move this, that line's not gone. In fact, it's probably better, I'll double back on that. It's probably better to have that not on the clipping plane layer. Or when the clipping plane is disabled or the clipping plane layer is off, that line work will still show up. But basically what we can do with that is we'll move our clipping plane around. We can add another line. Now let's say when I disable this, that line's still there. So I can move the clipping plane back to that line very easily if I wanted to, knowing that I want to do a section cut of now that second clipping plane line. Oops. We'll do that in a second. So I could do another clipping plane related make 2D of this if I wanted to. Let's make sure I'm in my A1 view, not zoomed out. Yep. And then again, making sure that the clipping plane itself is activated. There we go. Make 2D. Okay. So again, can just kind of very quickly get together a sequence of different cuts that might be meaningful to what I was looking at in the model. So additionally, I can do these operations in my 2D views, in my plan view, in my section views, or rather my elevation views. So let's say I wanted to mimic in plan and section what these cuts were, right? So we just make sure that our clipping plane is activated in each of the views. So now if I were to go to select my material, I go into the other scenes, and those cuts now are showing up. So I could say, all right, well, the rest of the model from this particular elevation is over here. It's hidden. I could do a make 2D of just this, and undo show hidden lines. And it should do the same thing as we had before with the cut. Oh, and another thing here that you'll notice, it's not showing everything because the clipping plane is active in this view as well. So this is where you got to be a little bit judicious about how you're using the clipping plane. So that line work actually should be in there. There it is. It was just hidden. It was clipped by the clipping plane. So this actually now, we could say this relates to our, basically, this view of the, if we're looking at this model from that side with the cut made, that's what's left over. We do the same thing in plan if we needed to. So re-enable our clipping. Is everybody following conceptually how that's working? Right? Okay. So you can quickly extract these different views. This section obviously would be looking from this way. In plan, if I enabled the clipping plane on the top view, we could very quickly do a make 2D of that. Let's make sure that we're in that view, or else we'll try to do all of them. Then we'll disable our clipping plane. Again, the gymnastics of this get a little bit annoying sometimes, but if you've done your layer management the right way, you can work your way around this pretty easily. So this object obviously is fairly simple, but there's a plan, a section cut, and a kind of 3D view section cut of the same object, not actually permanently worked on in the scene, or say we didn't actually delete information or permanently scar or alter the model. It's just extracting data using the clipping plane. We can do the same thing with the section tool, similar to the contours tool. So let's disable clipping plane. I'll just turn off clipping plane. And also for now, let's just turn off our make 2D information just for a second. Okay, so let's say I wanted to pull a series of flat sections, just the line work, not anything that's beyond, like the 3D information that was beyond. We don't need it right now. So we'll say section. So select the objects for sections. So I'm selecting all of these, and then basically I could go down the line, and sometimes this is kind of a guessing game in terms of where it's going to cut from, and you'll have to do it a couple times. It's based on the construction plane orientation, again, just like the clipping plane. So it's saying, all right, start of the section, let's say the start of the section is here, the end of the section is here. So there's a section now extracted. And I could go through and I could do that as many times as I want to at any part of the model. Then once that's complete, I've just escaped that. So these are still highlighted. I could move these out. I could actually then, let's say in 2D, I could arrange these in such a way that I'll be able to see them all next to one another. Oops. I'm just doing this very kind of quickly, but so now let's say we have this line work here. And in, I think, the front view, well, in one of these views. They exist, but you can see them here. Basically, they're all laid out. Oh, you know why? Our clipping plane was not disabled in that view. So let's disable clipping plane. There, there. So now we have multiple sections that we could start to draw comparisons across, pull out and you know, find a common point of reference, mark these in, maybe these run along the base of a larger layout of drawings that you've made, but you've marked them in your model itself, you know, somewhere along, hatch marked along the way here, where they were pulled from, so that your reviewer or someone else looking at this drawing, or you, can reference very quickly where this information is getting pulled from. So if I wanted to, just like with the 3D line work that we were doing, I'm in the front view here, I could do, just to flatten these, I could say make 2D. And it actually will, even though it is line work already, all this will do is basically say, all right, I'm going to flatten this line work. So I can go back to my top view, and again, we have our clipping plane issue here. We should be able to have a make 2D of that somewhere. Disable. At least that was the idea. Oh, you know why? Because I have my make 2D turned off. That's why. So you can see here. So you'll also notice that being mindful of where your other drawings that you've extracted are will become important. As, say, you've made multiple drawings from make 2D or extracted multiple things, they start to overlap each other. The workspace can get messy, so it's good to be aware of where these things get projected to. They're always projected in relation to the 0 point of the construction plane. So they're generally going to always be at the near the origin in relation to where they were actually in space. So you can start to use your top view of Rhino, plan view of Rhino, as a workspace to organize line work, understand multiple drawings in relation to each other, and prepare this for use in another program. Are any questions on that set of operations?
If you're cutting sections like you just did,
Mm-hmm.
is there a way to do it in accurate increments? To enter like a dimension or something?
So you could do contours of the object itself. That would be one. So contours you could set an interval. Let's see. Let's just look at the section command real quick again. So extend section, assign layers, join curves, group objects by section. No. Okay. So in this particular case, just with the basic section tool, I would have to have, I'd have to be discreet about it myself by setting up maybe a preset, sequence. I could also say, and this does not do, let's see here, let's say contour. If we do contour of the whole thing, and we do it horizontally rather than vertically, and then you can say distance between contours. This is going to be a little different than section though, right? Because this is just doing like the outer edge of the objects that you've collected. So you could technically get a section out of it, but it's going to be a little bit more finicky, I think, and from a true section definition standpoint. So yeah, you could say every 1 foot I want a contour section of this. And oh, you know why I didn't do it is because our it's in inches, but also our C plane was not appropriately oriented. So let's just quickly go back to our perspective view here. So that was a little bit more leeway. I'm going to hide this. I think I actually need to change my the contour plane approach. So basically when I gave it that information, it was saying, oh, well, everything's flat, so there's no contour for me to cut through. So I think if I do think if we do this, that might work. Contour base plane, direction perpendicular. Let's, yeah, 1. So that's every inch here, and you're right. The object was small enough that it probably wasn't making the right cut. But so then there is a similar cut actually to what happened with section. They're two. I guess they are closer to two sides of the same coin than I kind of was initially describing. So yeah, there's a quick way to pull out your sections. Okay, so then we could, I'm not going to go through this in so much detail because, again, we covered it last week and we covered it in this video that I want you guys to watch. And I apologize I didn't emphasize the urgency of checking that video out prior to some of your final production, more than just in that email. But basically, we can then take this information, we can export this information to export selected. And you can make it a drawing file, you can make it an AI file, name it whatever you need to, and then that information can be pulled into in Illustrator. And I think everyone is somewhat familiar with how to do that, right? Okay. So
Just again, that top line on the top, in the green,
Mhm.
that's the site plan for that particular section.
this here?
Yeah.
Yeah, that just happens to be the plan where it was cut for that
Right,
section
just
and
to
that.
make sure we
Yep,
got that.
yep,
Okay.
yep. So, right, and then so this obviously was done by being aware of where my clipping plane was active in the different viewports. So it's being organized in the process of the information and how you're organizing it. All right, so another thing, I want to troubleshoot just very briefly that like extreme perspective make 2D fail. I don't know if we might have to make something a little bit more complicated for this to work. All right, let's do this. Let's say I'm going to hide this. I don't necessarily need this scene. Let's hide this for now. I'm going to make a series of just like vertical extrusions. Maybe I'll even array them. Let's say 15 in the X direction, 15 in the Y, just 1 in the Z. And then I can space these out. Okay, so I have this array of objects, and let's say then I've created some sort of clearing of these objects for these objects. Maybe there's some sort of shape in here that is interesting. I don't know. That we extrude up or something. Great, look at that, architecture. All right, so now let's add, you can type plane. This is the same as just making a surface, but say you wanted a ground plane that's flat, just type plane, and that is a quick way to make a surface, a ground surface for your work. I'm gonna delete this other information. No, let's just hide this other information. We might return to it, but okay. Let's say that I have this object here or this scene, and I want to do a make 2D from in here. But there are objects around me on all sides. Let's say my viewport is a little bit more extreme. Let's say it's 25 millimeters. Does everybody know how to adjust the lens length of the camera? Okay. Again, some of this stuff I was going to cover in more detail in the rendering sections, but I'm realizing now that we should probably have covered this a little bit sooner. So your default projection of the viewport is, in perspective, is 50 millimeters. So think of a 50 millimeter camera. It's actually pretty flat. Just for reference, we are generally seeing in like a 30-ish millimeter kind of perspective. A camera, a 35 millimeter camera, like that type of projection is, roughly, well, I'm no expert on that, but the lower that you go with that, the more extreme the perspective is going to be. The higher that you go with the lens length, the more close to a real axonometric or an isometric projection that you're going to be, right? So let's say I had, 15 millimeters. It's going to be really extreme. Sometimes that's useful to see what's going on in the scene, but it also, the foreshortening is crazy. The distortion in the foreground versus the background is really intense, right? So it sometimes can be detrimental to, the accuracy of what you're trying to show. Sometimes, though, you need it. Sometimes you need it to be. So when I'm in a scene like this, I can adjust my camera. I can toggle my camera at smaller intervals using my mouse and using the control, holding down the control button. So basically, in the same way that I'm orbiting around the scene to model something, say I want to set my view up. Say I want to set my view up at 6 feet. So we've drawn this a little bit out of scale because I've just been eyeballing it. But let's make an actual 6 foot curve, just so that we can get this right. Oops. All right. So I'll make this 6 foot in height, and it's probably going to be really tall. So we'll scale this appropriately to fit that. Just scale the whole thing up. All right, so let's say if I'm a 6 foot tall person like that plane, these are a little bit taller than me. All right, let's say we're about there. So now I could, if I wanted to, I could draw, and this is a kind of an analog way of doing this, but I could draw a reference plane at 6 foot height or at 5'6" or whatever your eye level would be. So it's probably, if you're at 6 foot height, it's a little bit tall. So we could say, to be really accurate with our, say our eye level projection, we could say we're 5'6" eye height. That's still a pretty tall person, but so that's where our eyes would be at that point. So I could eyeball this by saying, okay, when my camera view is roughly parallel to that, I'm more or less at 6 feet in the model, or 5'6" in the model. And I could say another just kind of good general rule of thumb when you're setting up views is try to restrict where possible multiple vanishing points, right? So like in this case, it's a little bit tweaked. We have this slight angle to the lines. Maybe that's important to you getting the right angle of everything in the scene, but for right now, I think we can just rotate our camera enough that we kind of get a closer to parallel kind of projection. And again, this is just kind of eyeballed in this particular case. And then I can use my shift button to just pan the camera up and down rather than rotating the camera. If I wasn't holding shift down, the camera would be actually rotating around, right? My view would be rotating around. So right here, I'm more or less at the view of potentially of a person in this space, and I've just used some analog metrics, analog visual metrics in the space to set that up. You can also be more specific about your camera view. For the sake of what you guys have done to this point, I'm going to wait on that until we do renderings. You can actually set up multiple cameras that have different properties and are set at a certain point. And there are objects in the scene basically that you can toggle on and off, but we'll come back to that. So, yeah, question.
So you use the command viewport properties, and then you set it to 25 millimeters or 50 millimeters.
Or whatever you want. Yep.
To just drop you into the scene.
No, that's just changing the projection of the scene. That's just changing the projection of the camera. So let's save this view real quick. I'll save the view. We'll say, I will call this. Let's just call it B1, just so that it's something that we can easily reference, B1. All right, so that shows up. There it is. So if I were to zoom back out on this, you can see like the projection of the whole scene is in that 25 millimeter, right? Mm-hmm. So that's simply setting what the camera lens length is. So if I go back to viewport properties and I were to change this to 25, you'll see that this changes it looks like I zoomed in, but it actually just kind of, it foreshortened it normalized how the lens length is dealing with the scene. So it basically, the shorter the lens length, the more you're going to be able to see within one particular camera view, but the more fisheyed it starts to become, or the more distorted, right? So I could change these viewports. I could change this back to 50, and it will look like we've zoomed in again, but in fact, the edges of our scene start to look a little bit more normalized, right? And if I were to go into so now if I go into my B1, if I try to get a view from using my 50 millimeter camera angle, you'll see that It's a little bit more difficult, if only because everything is looks like it's just closer up. I'm just seeing less. So I can subtly zoom out by holding down that control and just shifting in or out. That's just the toggle for the sort of incremental zoom, which becomes useful when you're setting up views, let's say. So say I want to see one more of these extrusions, I could zoom this back. Well, and now I'm hitting the back of that, right? So then you start to toggle between, all right, you know what, my camera angle wants to be something that's a little bit more like 35. Okay, that starts to show me more. Now I can normalize my scene based on that, or I can go back to my pre-saved B1 view, which is here, and I know that that saves all the camera properties as well. So that's at 15. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. All right. So now let's say that we wanted to do a make 2D of this, of B1. This may work, and then I will be sad because I want it to not work. But let's see. So I've selected all my objects. I want to do a make 2D of this beautiful view. And we'll maintain source layers fine. There's no clipping planes in the scene, but it's on, so it doesn't matter. So we'll say current view, maintain source layers, OK. And notice already that it took a little bit longer to try to figure that out than the normal projection view, because there's just more material that it was having to deal with. So now we need to find the object. Zoom selected is a way to do it. So actually that worked out pretty good. Unfortunately, that worked out really well. So notice though that it's quite small because we're in inches projection, and we had scaled the heck out of this object, right? So what we were working in when we were just eyeballing stuff at the beginning was it was kind of scaleless, small little objects. So whenever you make 2D something, it will keep it selected. So when you go into your top view or another view to look at it, if you can't find it, if it's missing from the scene, you can type zoom selected or toggle that hotkey on your mouse. There's a way to do that as well to find it. So ZS was the zoom selected command. So if it's out of sight, you can bring it into the scene. On a drawing here to talk about line weights. I did not put them on any different layers. So in this particular case, I could go in and manually, using my direct selection tool, the white arrow, and holding down Shift, I can select multiple objects that I know are associated with, visually with each other, so the groundscape, say, and I could just create a series of layers that I want to use to start to organize those. So, and again, this is something that, if we're doing this the right way, we would do this right out of Rhino, but just for this moment, it's okay. So notice I'm just moving some stuff around to different layers. This is something that you guys should be basically familiar with at this point. Call this ribbon. So that's our ribbon. And then we also have our dense line work of columns here. And again, you know, there is some inaccuracy kind of to this way of doing it, right? If we had done this, if we had organized these in Rhino and not on one layer, obviously all this stuff would be properly organized already, but that's fine. Oops, put it on columns. Looks like a few more strays here. Just going to move those to my columns layer. And again, from a filtering standpoint, sometimes turning off the layer that you've created that you're going to move stuff to just allows you to visually see what you have left over to that you still need to work with. So topography. So it looks like now we have topography, we got our ribbon, we have our columns. Great. All right, so now we can quickly go in and start to, and it looks like we have one little stray, our make 2D visible. We'll make that topography. Now also notice that there's nothing on the make 2D layer, so we can just delete it. If you ever try to delete a layer in Illustrator and there's work on it, it will tell you, it will say, columns contain artwork, do you want to delete it? It'll give you a failsafe. So if you're doing this exercise, you're moving some things around, some layers suddenly don't have anything on them, it's worth deleting them. If you delete them and they delete without getting that warning, then it means there's nothing there. All right, so I got this weird scene on a piece of paper. I could adjust my document size like we did last week. I could change this to 11 by 17 if I wanted to. Frankly, it's fine for the sake of what we're doing with it right now, to just keep it as it is. So I also want to adjust the line weight of a lot of this stuff. So let's say our topography and our ribbon is turned off. All right, so just like good rule of thumb when it comes to how objects read in a scene, this is way too heavy. I mean, the line work here it's just way too dark. We want this to be lighter, first of all. So we can select all these things. Notice that they're all 1 point line coming out of Rhino in this particular case. So I can start to just kind of visually mess around with a few smaller lines. Say it's 0.25 to start. All right, that's reading a little bit better. But now the hierarchy of the outline of each of these shapes is lost, right? So and this is where Illustrator, you know, can be a little tedious. But this is the difference between a confusing drawing and a good drawing. Or one layer of that is line work and line weights. So basically, one approach here is your outlines of objects become a darker line weight than the internal lines. That's a drawing convention that is a drafting convention that is fairly time-honored. And there are also a sequence of weights that we could apply to basically the internal lines within an object. For outside corners, inside corners, different types of stuff. Also, it's just related to what you want to be emphasizing in the drawing, where there's not always a hard and fast rule to what should read as dark and what should read as light, but generally it makes sense from your kind of mind's eye standpoint to organize outlines of figures and objects as a heavier line weight. Of course, section cuts and analytical line cuts as darker as well, so that you understand that something's happening there. And then other line work that is detail lines generally wants to be lighter. It's not backgrounded, it colors in the basic information that the darker lines have set up in hierarchy. So I could say that these frontal lines here, maybe they're not 1 point, but they're 0.75. So then suddenly the read of those lines is much cleaner. There's hierarchy attached to the line work now in a way that didn't really exist before. So I'm just manually going through and toggling with my shift and my zoom and my selection command some of these lines. I could also keep all these lines exactly as they are, not change them at all, and then draw line work over them if I wanted to emphasize different weights to things. So let's say I went back into my layers and I made a object outline layer or something like that. So now I could say, all right, all this stuff, the baseline information is intact. I'm not changing that, but I wanted to make sure that some of this stuff reads a little bit more crisply. So I could use my pen tool to draw new shapes that I know have a specific weight to them, say 0.75 in this case. So I go to my pen tool. I can make sure that how the pen tool is going to draw this shape that I'm going to make, it's going to have no fill, and it's going to have a stroke that's black in color, and it's going to have a stroke weight that's 0.75. I could change that to something else, but that's where I want it right now. I could also before I draw one line on this, I could go to my sub-options of the stroke and ensure that the way that the corners are drawn with that shape are going to be rounded cap or straight projecting cap, depending on what I want. We talked previously about the rounded cap edge generally helps your line work read in a nicer way. There's not those broken edges that have little openings to them. And I could even say, all right, I want all these lines to be dashed as I draw them. So I could say, all right, let's make this a dashed line. This is basically setting up the parameter of the filter for the line that I'm about to draw. And I could change the way that it reads at the edges. There's all kinds of little things that I could be doing here. So let's say, okay, now with my pen tool selected and my other layers locked, because I know I just want to be drawing on this layer and I'm using these as my trace, I could go around and use the clip points of these other layers to draw another shape that highlights what I want. And in this particular case, I made it dotted, which maybe that's fine. Maybe we want to change the dotted line. Maybe the dotted line actually wants to be a straight line, not a rounded cap, because it looks a little weird. So there's our dotted line. We could change the gap of that. Maybe the spacing of those want to be different. You know, all that stuff is editable, as we've seen in previous classes. So now, again, you're starting to see, and I can go back and I can change anything. I can undash this if I want to. The beauty with Illustrator is it's a series of filters, not actual permanent work done, right? So when I made a series of dashed lines, it didn't suddenly make 50 dashed lines. It's one object that looks like dashed lines. So I can quickly change the attributes of that object if I want to in a quick way. So yeah, let's say I do that a couple more times at these objects here. But then let's say I want to, for whatever reason, I want to highlight one of these in particular. Let's say this particular one is of interest to me. So I'll turn these things back on. Actually, it might work better to select, and this is where drawing with another layer of line work, where you can control if it's a closed shape or not, sometimes is a little bit more useful, right? Because now I can select that whole object rather than going back and selecting the individual lines from that other layer. So let's select those two dotted lines that I made. Let's undash them. But say I want to make this particular one, you know, a different colored line weight. I can make this red. And that line work is on top of the other line work, so you're not seeing the black line overlapping it. This also becomes important, just where layers are. If I were to take this down to the bottom, all the black line work that was below it suddenly is above it, and it looks bad. So you want to be aware of where these layers are. So say if you're diagramming something, you're overlaying something, generally that's going to want to be on top so that it covers up the other lines. Say I want this line to be the same as the other one, match properties. Okay, say also I wanted to fill this line with something. So we could have a fill for this. Let's say that the fill is like a lightish, actually let's say it's also red. So right now, basically this just looks like there's no hierarchy to that. You can't see the line work versus the fill, but I can adjust the opacity of any of these things so that it reads a little bit more clearly. So again, this is another advantage to having a traced shape or another shape on top of the existing line work, that you can adjust it, you can filter it how you want. So in my appearance menu here, appearance, which is below transparency. What's in the appearance menu? This is very important in Illustrator. You can add all kinds of effects to your line work, to your drawing objects. You can change the way that the fills and the strokes read against one another, how the transparency is, and it's all toggleable as if it were a layer. So let's say that I wanted to, just very quickly, I don't want to delete the fill, but I want to see what this line would look like without the fill. So I could just turn it off in the appearance menu. So it's actually like a sub-layer menu that allows you to check on various attributes of your object. So now, if you'll notice here, there's little pull-down arrows that have additional attributes for each of the things that are attached to this object that I made. So right now, it's fairly simple. It has a stroke and it has a fill. The stroke is a fully opaque, it's a fully opaque edge, and the fill is also opaque. But I could adjust the transparency here in the transparency panel. Say opacity just for the fill is 25%. And I click OK, click Enter. So now the fill itself is 25%, but the stroke stays solid, and I can quickly filter then the, if I were to drag this over to the side, it's just it's a shape outline that hasn't affected anything that from the base work that I made. So it's a way that I can quickly highlight different things in the model that I've made or the drawing that I've made. Say I want this to match the properties of that, I could go over here and click Match Properties, and it will make it the same object. And then if I wanted to adjust the opacity of that thing, I can easily go back here and change it to 50 or change it to 15. There's a lot of control over, again, the visual sort of check of what you've drawn is it's a great place to organize all of those various filters and understand like what you've put into the scene and change it if you need to. It's all able to be turned off. So I could turn the stroke off if I wanted to on these things. I'd have to make sure that the thing's selected. Let's say I wanted the stroke to be invisible and I just wanted the fill. Fine, easy to do. I could change the line weight right here if I wanted to. So that one's thicker. So again, just different ways to toggle this stuff. Obviously our topography layout, our topography line work is maybe a little too heavy. It's the ground, maybe we change that to 0.25. Even this guy's a little bit heavy. Maybe the line work there is 0.5. We talked last time, if you guys remember, about kind of the general range of line weights that at the scales of 8.5 by 11, 11 by 17, at the drawing sizes that you've started to make, even on bigger layouts, like, of course, you could have a 4-point line or a 15-point line. It's really heavy and thick. But for the kind of the detailed architectural work that's operating at general scales that people are used to, between 0.1 and 1 generally is a good place to be kind of adjusting that line work. It's like a 0.25 line work for details, or 0.2. 0.5 for something, say, that we want to highlight in the scene but isn't the most important thing. Maybe 1 point for something that we are section cutting through, or 1.5 point for that, or something like that. So again, these are not hard and fast rules, but that line weight implies, again, like this, why is this heavier than these ones? There's something important about that. These already read better as individual objects in a field just by outlining the object itself and having the detail lines be lighter, right? So that's paramount to you guys making successful drawings. We could do our Make 2D operation on this our live paint operation on this if we wanted to. I could hide my object layers. We could select all this, and in this particular case, maybe we make a copy of this information. Control C, make a Make 2D or a live paint layer that we'll just move to the bottom, and then I could actually just move all of this information down, or Control V to paste in place. So in this particular case, what it did is it pasted. It didn't delete any of the line work that I already made, but it just made a copy of all of it, moved it all into one layer. Then I can move that down to the live paint layer, turn it off. All my stuff's still there. But now if I wanted to, I could just work in here in my live paint layer, make this a live paint bucket object, and start to fill it in with textures and things like that. Or we can go to our swatches panel like we did last week. We could we can mess with our graphics. Maybe there's a particular kind of architectural hatch or something that you wanted to apply to the ground. Just very quickly do that. And say we wanted to adjust the scale of that hatch, we can go to Object, Scale, transform that. Say we want to just transform the pattern, not the object itself. I can unclick Object and it will say, okay, transform pattern. If I preview this and I were to toggle this number, all this is doing is messing with the size of the hatch itself. So I've hatched it already, but I want it to be a little bit bigger or a little bit smaller. It lets me do that very easily by adjusting the scale of the transform pattern, in the scale transform menu. So again, I'm just starting to get some layers of subtlety or hierarchy or whatever I wanted to be adding to this drawing, whatever it is. I could turn these other layers back on. There's some approaches to live paint in this particular case where the live paint that you're making is just about the texture itself, and maybe the line work is all done on these other layers. So you could, we in theory could just make all the line work on this layer invisible, because that's not the point of it. So just from an organizational standpoint, I can turn my other layers back on. I know where everything is, but now I know that just on the live paint layer is my ability to kind of fill in things in different ways. But my line work I can still adjust kind of free of that live paint. Because if you guys noticed from last week, as soon as you live paint something, it locks all those things. It doesn't lock them all, but it creates like a subgroup where it's harder to select things. Your line work might get a little bit weird. It's just harder to control. So by organizing things that way. All right, so I'm in Photoshop. I'm going to open up that bird reference photo. Everyone, again, should be able to access it from online. Okay, so a couple things that we can do here. Just a very, very brief intro to the layout in Photoshop if you've never opened it before. Similar to Illustrator, similar to Rhino and in InDesign, actually. There's a kind of a control bar along the left that has your main kind of toggle, cut and paste, crop, and photo kind of adjustment tools. Then on the right side, there's a sequence of menus that you can, just like in Illustrator, you can add to, take away from. You can change the workspace settings to be positioned towards certain types of workflows. So if you know that you're going to be doing something specific with motion capture, which some of you might, you can bring up a video timeline and actually insert, say, an MP4 that you've created of recording from your phone or recording from a camera. workspace is more of a, let's say, photography. So basically you should have a layers panel. There's some adjustments up here that we'll look at in more detail as we edit these images. Obviously, we have our workspace here with our photo. The way to navigate around the image itself is if you hold down spacebar, you can pan. Say I'm zoomed in and I want to pan left to right on the photo. There's also kind of a dynamism to it. Like if I hold down spacebar and drag and then let go, it'll actually, it'll continue. There's momentum. So the way you stop that is just by left clicking again, and then you can stop it. So if you're working on something large, you can move across the expanse of the space pretty quickly. If you type Control-0, that will essentially zoom to the extent of the image. Control-1 zooms to what Photoshop is reading as the sort of quote-unquote full resolution of the image. So as we start to zoom beyond this point, pixelation starts to occur. The resolution of the image has reached its limit essentially at this point. So if I were to go up to my images panel up here and check on my image size, all this stuff is somewhat relative. In other words, if I were to print this photograph out at 32 inches by 15 inches high, it would be at a 72 pixel per inch resolution, which is not great. That's not a great resolution. For the sake of, that's a pretty decent size. So maybe from far away that would look fine, but as you get closer to it, that's not going to look great. If you're operating in, so if we make the image smaller and the resolution were to go up, we could resample the image here. Let's go. So if I were to unclick resample image and click, let's say I wanted the resolution to be 150, and again, this is all relative. This is all related to the size that you printed at. I'm not actually changing necessarily anything in the drawing, but what I am saying is, okay, at full size, 150 resolution, 150 pixels per inch, which is going to read on a computer screen in a cleaner way, going to read as you start to approach it on the wall in a cleaner way. The actual more comfortable size for this photograph is about half of what we had before, 15, almost 16 inches by 7 inches. So these are things to keep in mind, like checking the properties of imagery that you bring into your file. Knowing the pixel size is actually probably more important than what the document size is telling you, because the document size is related to, it's a math equation basically related to, okay, if I want my resolution to be 600, then the size of this image can only be 4 by 2. And so when it's this big, the image resolution is quite high. But as soon as I blow it up, it starts to go down. So this is all relative to size. Your pixel size really is where bringing in good quality stuff from outside Photoshop becomes important. So if I were to go back, for example, to our Google search and look for something just generic, the tools, we could say larger than 2 megapixels. So that starts to become a larger file, but then you start to see, okay, this is actually quite a large image if I'm able to access this without needing to pay somebody for it. It's quite a large image. If I were to be able to save this, not as a web page, then when I bring this into Photoshop, it's going to be quite large. Let me see if I can find one that. A lot of these are clearly on sites that don't want you. That looks like it's maybe okay. Just for reference. So I'm going to open this back up. Just Control-O to open. Just like, again, you're starting to probably recognize that the workflow across multiple programs, from a baseline command standpoint, starts to be similar with the Adobe programs. So our image size in this case is actually pretty large. So if we were to Control-1, we can zoom in a lot and still have there's a lot of detail to this image, right? So this is just something to keep in mind as you start to pull textures, images, people or trees, skies, other things from online, or scans of things to incorporate into your imagery and your design work, the resolution and the pixel size is important. So, okay, so let's say that we wanted to, I want to extract from this 3 of these birds. I'm going to extract this one, and then the one here. And we're going to move these to another file, and I'm going to start to match these up with, let's transform the bird into a person or something, just to show just some different ways to cut things out. So I'm going to use my lasso tool to select objects in the scene and kind of cut around them in clean ways. So there's a couple different ways to use your lasso tool. So first thing I need to do actually too is, my background is locked right now. So the layer is locked. If I just double click this, it will unlock it. It will turn it into layer 0. We can just call this base image. Okay. All right, so now I want to, again, create a series of kind of supports for both cutting out relevant information in the image and then starting to collage that or paste that into other drawings that I'm going to be making. So let's zoom in on kind of the corner here of the top, and our bird number 1, we can use our lasso tool to cut that out. So there's a few different ways to do this. The lasso tool, the freeform lasso tool, you'll notice here, if I were to just click my left mouse and start to kind of outline this, I'm holding down my left mouse and I'm just kind of eyeballing the cut for this. That was a quick and dirty way to do that. I could copy this selection by typing Control-C, Control-V. So if I were to turn off my base image, just that selection is cut out. But if you want to be a little bit more accurate with it, you can use different aspects of the lasso tool. There's the polygonal lasso and the magnetic lasso as well. There are other ways to select things, but let's, just for the sake of argument, let's choose our polygonal lasso. So what that does is it lets me use a series of control points and straight lines. Whenever I left click and then just let go, it creates another point around which I can be a little bit more controlled in my selection as I work my way around the image. So not quite as free form and flowing as our baseline lasso tool, but ultimately lets you have a little bit more accuracy. Also notice if you double click something a little too quickly, it might complete the selection. So let me get to a point that, actually let me just select this all and then we'll troubleshoot that. So you can kind of see that just being able to click this in the same way that I'd create maybe a surface in Rhino or something, or draw a shape in CAD, gives me a little bit more accuracy over what I'm selecting. Once I've completed a selection and the dotted line shows up, I can go back in, and if I hold down if I hold down Alt, I can remove elements from the selection. So say I wanted that edge to be gone, say I wanted to soften up the top of the bird's head or something. So I'm still selecting areas, but they're basically areas then to be removed when I hold down that Alt button. You see the little minus sign on the lasso.
Is there a way to make it grow?
Yeah, so if I hold down Shift, you can add to your selection. So say I wanted to, add all this stuff over to it. Type Enter, then you're good. So you can kind of quickly toggle between removing areas and adding to areas as you see fit to kind of add to the accuracy of the selection that you've made. Go back in, and after you've made that initial, maybe you use the basic lasso to do some initial selection, and then you go in with some of these other lasso tools to clean it up a little bit. So then I could copy that. Oops. Control-C, Control-V. Control-V, Control-Shift-V pastes it in place over the image. If I just typed Control-V, it's going to copy it anywhere. Control-Shift-V lets me copy it right in the spot. If I want to undo multiple steps, I have to hold down Control-Alt-Z. just simply typing Control-Z, like which is the undo in a lot of these other programs, will only just undo and then actually redo the previous command. So it's undoing the last thing I did, and then it's actually undoing the undo. So it's only a one step back when you do that. But when you type Control-Alt-Z, hold down the Control-Alt-Z, that will allow you to step back multiple times. So now I have, if we were to slide this over here, we have a bird that's, kind of loosely selected, one that's a little bit more accurate. And then a third way that you could select this stuff is with the magnetic lasso tool. So the magnetic lasso tool can be very useful. It does very well when you have a high contrast image. What the magnetic lasso tool is trying to do is say, okay, I will guess where I want you to draw the lines, or where you want me to draw the points, but I'm going to use the drawing information and the contrast of the drawing information to try to guess that. So I'm going to change my frequency to a little bit higher than, I'm going to change it to 100. Now I left click once, and then as I drag my tool, it actually highlights, I'm not clicking anything right now, I'm just slowly going over the area that I want traced. And it's highlighting using kind of its best guess where the edges are. You're going to notice here in a second, this is an easy operation for the magnetic tool to do right this moment because it's a black and white image. But as we get up to this point, the bird's beak, the kind of the edges of that moment where the contrast goes down, it's less accurate. It's confused. So the contrast there is harder to define. So you can control this a little bit by more quickly kind of hovering your mouse over that area and like getting the magnetic tool to strike through there faster. You could also just, again, use in combination like some other elements, some other lasso tools to add back in portions of the bird that we lost. Okay. So I have now 3 different ways that I've traced my birds. I'm going to just quickly go and trace. Again, let's find a couple bird shapes that are different than that one. So maybe the full flight bird here. This one's actually pretty good contrast, so maybe we do magnetic lasso. And again, it struggles a little bit with that head. So that's decent. So we'll copy him. I also could make, from a layer management standpoint, I can make a series of subfolders in Photoshop. So I could call this bird cutouts. That's just the folder button down at the bottom of the layer menu. And we'll call this, I'll call this bird number, I believe that was bird number 3. So bird number 3. And I think in the context of the other birds that we cut out for the first one, the best one, bird number 1 was a little bit inaccurate. Bird number 2, decent. I think our bird number 2 was probably the best one, so we'll call that, or layer number 2, excuse me. So bird number 2. Put those into our bird cutouts folder. So now I can quickly toggle the bird cutouts layer on and off if I want to. That's controlling both of those layers together. I could also start to do things just to that, just to this folder if I wanted to. I could change the opacity of just these birds by adjusting the opacity up here. It's not doing anything else to the rest of the image. Probably a little bit difficult to see with our overlay, but we'll look at it in a minute in another file. So let's now let's get one more bird kind of in the midst of its flying. Maybe we do this one here where the wings are. Actually, let's do this one where we can see the head of the bird. Bird number 9. Again, just kind of loosely doing this for the sake of right now. The level with which you decide to trace or cut out your own imagery that you've made of yourself is up to your hand. So copy paste that. Call that bird number 9. Make sure that that's in our bird cutouts folder. So now we should have essentially these 3 birds. And if I have all of these at the same time, if I have the bird cutouts folder selected, which they're all located in, I could select any one of the birds themselves and it's going to move the whole selection together, which is a nice function. I can obviously also go then into the file and individually select each of the birds. Also, if you're ever wondering which layer something is on, you can right-click the object or right-click the whole screen. And it will tell you, just kind of like in Rhino, where you can see if there's multiple objects that are on top of one another, and it gives you the ability to select any of those things. This is saying, okay, in this spot that you just right-clicked on, there's the bird cutouts folder that has bird number 3 there, and there's also base image, which is here. So I can choose either of those just from the sub-selection menu. Say I know I wanted to work on the base image, but that bird number 3 was in the way. Once I have that base image selected, then I can left-click and select that as I need to, or move it around, or do things to it. So it's just from an image and layer management standpoint that helps you keep track of where things are. Okay, so let's say that we want to move this to a new file. So I'm going to turn these elements off. I'm going to another thing you can do here, say for some reason we wanted to actually combine all these onto one layer and they're not separate layers anymore. In this particular case, I think we're going to want them to remain as separate layers, but I can just show you how this works. Say you've copied and pasted multiple pieces of information to make a collage, and you have several layers and you want to flatten those layers so that it's more manageable. You could right-click a selection of layers, and you can merge those layers in different ways. So we can, in this particular case, I could say, all right, I want to merge these layers into one layer. And what that's going to do is it's just going to collapse them into whatever the top layer's name was. So right now, I could have all these selected, and when I'm moving them around, it's moving all of them at once. If I select an individual one, I can move it individually, or I can right-click multiple pieces of them and merge them, and then it's one layer that has each of those elements on it. So again, this is just from an organizational standpoint, good to keep in mind. So a few more things that we can do here is, let's say that we now want to, our base image, say we've extracted the information that we want from our base image in this case. We can return to it, but for now, we can just keep it turned off. For my own sake in Photoshop, I could right-click this layer and change the color of the layer itself, just to give me a quick visual reference that, okay, I want this off red. I could also lock the layer. I can do various other things to it with some of these sub-menu items. For now, though, I think just having it be red and turned off is fine. So a couple things you'll probably notice here with Photoshop layers versus Illustrator layers or Rhino layers in particular. You can change the color of these layers. We can go to, if we right-click, we can change it to any color we want, generally any color we want. But the way that Photoshop layers work is not exactly the same as Illustrator and Rhino. It's a little bit more piecemeal. Obviously, your ability to toggle things on and off is the same, and the baseline reasoning for it, for drawing organization and being able to apply certain effects to certain layers, keep certain things that are like one another on similar layers, is important. But as opposed to Illustrator, where the visual support is referenced in the image itself, where you can see the color of the layer when you've selected it in the model or in the drawing space. That's not necessarily going to be the case with Photoshop. That's going to be, the colors are more of a readout for the layer panel itself, but that's not going to change how my selection of this bird looks when I touch it. So just something to keep in mind. I'm going to say no color for that. So in this particular case, let's just save him with the filter that's over it. Because what I want to do with this is actually edit out some of these things. So I'll save this in references and then I'll upload it real quick for you guys. Okay. Okay. So that should be uploaded. Decent. All right, does everybody have that on Dropbox? Access to that on Dropbox? All right, so let's say we want to add this guy to our scene, and I don't want him holding that wrench anymore, so I'll just cut that wrench out. So we can go around and we can, actually in this particular case, since the background is the contrast is great, we can use the magic wand tool. So the magic wand tool below the lasso tool allows you to click an area that it will basically say, all right, everything in the scene that is essentially this color with some tolerance, I'll select and cut out for you so that I can very quickly say, all right, I want that gone. And the sort of checkered background is an implication that there's nothing there. There's no objects there. That's an empty backdrop. So if I were to type Control T, while I have my object selected, a selection box comes up around it that lets me resize that object if I want to manually. I can use the corners and hold down Shift to proportionally resize that person. If I press Escape, if I haven't pressed Enter while I'm in that command, it will bring me back to where I was before. So what that has also shown me is when I type Control T, it looks like there's still objects out in space here that they might be stray white lines from the selection that I did before with the magic wand. If this were truly just the object of the man in the scene, our toggle box would be just around him. So we could filter this a little bit more by using our lasso tool and just doing a quick cutout around him to say, all right, we want to delete everything outside of this selection. So we'll say that. And then actually what I want to do is, I don't want to select him. If I were to select delete right now, it would delete him. But I actually want to select the inverse of that. So I can type Control-Shift-I, and that will select the inverse of that scene. So I can just click delete. Now if I were to do the Control-T, it looks like it's a little bit more accurately within the context of the guy. So for right now, we won't worry about these other... Actually, you know what? Let's do it. Just this gives you exposure to a couple other tools. So let's say I want to get rid of this little camera brand, stock camera brand that's on his pants. I can use, there's a few different tools here. I can use the clone tool to just cover this up. I could also copy elements of what's already on the image here, just using my polygonal lasso, and copy that over. And then using Control-T, once I've made a copy of that, I can move it over and start to rotate it into place to kind of cover up some of the stuff that's on that I want to mask. So let's say that I want to make this fit that area a little bit better. I can hold down my Control button, and while I hold down Control and then drag with my left click any of these toggle points, it will actually distort the image. So I could kind of stretch it into place how I want to. Up and down, I can use the up and down toggles, the middle toggle. If I am holding Shift and using one of these corners, I can mimic, again, kind of a perspectival shift of the guy's pants here. And then once it's kind of positioned in place how I want it, I can click enter. And we've gotten rid of that. We've gotten rid of that brand, but it looks like there's still a little bit of like kind of an edge to this that's not so great. We can erase the edge of that to soften it using the eraser tool. But if you go up to the eraser tool and you use, let's soften our opacity and our flow at the top so that the edges of this object are, it won't just be immediately cut out like with a hard line, but it will be kind of slowly erased. You can see my eraser here. Before I do anything to this area, I want to change the size of my eraser. I can just use the right and left bracket next to the P on the keyboard. Left and right bracket will make the eraser smaller or larger. So the right bracket makes it larger, the left bracket makes it smaller. So again, I'm trying to show you guys some useful hotkeys that can quickly let you toggle through workflow in Photoshop. So I'm going in here and I've changed my opacity and my flow, and now I'm going to soften kind of the edges of this guy's pants so that it's just covering up. And what I'm doing is I'm clicking left clicking and then I'm dragging to delete something. And then if I want to go over that layer again with another level of pressure, I'd have to left click and drag another time over it. So I'm kind of almost like a paintbrush. I'm kind of stroking through multiple layers of the eraser. So, and if I wanted to go back, I can type Control-Alt-Z, like if I'm realizing that camera is getting revealed or something. So anyways, we get this to the point that it's fairly kind of meshed in place. And it looks like my computer's lagging a little bit, but you get the idea. Quick escape. So okay, so we've masked that. You could go around and you could mask additional areas of this. We could select this area here if we wanted to, and making sure that we're on the base layer, not on our second layer, which is only that portion of his pants that we copied. We want to make sure we're here to operate on this part. I could use the clone tool, clone stamp, to pull reference points on the image from elsewhere and basically paint those into this area. So I could say, if I hold down Shift, a little aim, a crosshair will come up basically that says, all right, where do you want me to pull this from? I'm holding Shift down. I'll say, all right, I want to pull the blue that I'm going to mimic up here from this area. So I left click it once, and then I can let go, and now you can see as I drag over that area, there's a little blue, an implication of blue as I make my cursor bigger. I could also, so if I drag my blue, if I drag my left click, it will apply that clone area. But now notice that the clone area is basically, it's still moving around areas of the image that I've clicked on. So it looks like it's moved by this point. It's moved over to the white shirt. So I might need to resample to make sure that I get the blue all the way across. So I could re-click this area and then sample again. Kind of, again, there's just kind of almost a painterly aspect to this where you have to pull things multiple times. I could Control-D removes the selection box around what I just was looking at. So I could just like take a second and look at what I was masking. Control-Z would undo that, so I still have it there. Notice too that I didn't make a new layer in this case, which is probably a mistake. I just stamped right over the base image. So now that change to his shirt is fully in the base image, which is not ideal. You probably want that to be a separate layer that you copy out that selection, and then clone things over that area so that you can be controlled about it. But notice as well that if I were to have done it to the base image, if I know that I'm not going to need to go back and have that camera brand show up, I know that I want to make this a permanent part of the base image. I could do it the way I just did, and it won't clone outside of the selection area. Notice that I'm trying to drag over here. It's not doing anything. It will only clone within the context of the selection that I've made. So I could start to be very specific about, all right, if I wanted to just clone something over his nose or his face, I could do that. let's say another thing here that I want to do, I want to apply a layer mask to this, and I want to remove the wrench from his hand. So I can go to Add Layer Mask, which is this little rectangle with the circle in the bottom, and a separate layer, a separate like linked area will come next to the layer that I chose. So in this particular case, what this is, it's a filter that lets me hide things but not fully delete them, even though it looks like I am deleting them. So I'm going to select my wrench. All right, wrench selected. Now if I delete it, but I have the layer mask highlighted, it doesn't actually delete it. It's just, it's pretending that it's not there. It's a filter. So I could slowly have this layer mask or portions of this mask come back by toggling between the black and the white colors here. So basically what I did, the way the layer mask works is anything that is in white is able to be seen, and anything that is in black is completely invisible, and then everything in between, gray, gradient, is that level of opacity. So say I turned my eraser tool on, and I flipped my black and my white so that it's actually saying, all right, I want you, I want to flip my, my paintbrush on, brush tool. So with my brush, with black chosen, if I were to brush over this area with the layer mask selected, it should let me, oh, I'm sorry, no, I do need it to be white. So if I brush over this area, it should bring back parts of the wrench. So basically it's saying, all right, this is a mask for this image. Nothing in this image is getting deleted. And I can quickly toggle between, all right, I want the whole wrench to be back, great. Or I just want certain parts of it to go away, so I'd have to, in this case, to make something invisible, I'd have to switch to black, and then I could use my paintbrush to get rid of it. Notice that I'm also now deleting part of his hand. I didn't want to do that, so I could go back and using my selection tool, I could be a little bit more specific. This part I don't want deleted from the layer mask. I want to make sure that that's white, so I could click delete, and it should come back. Oh, I still think I need to use my paintbrush in this case. That's fine, that's fine. So again, bringing it back to the image, you want to make sure that the white is in the front. Paintbrush, you can paint that back. And again, it's only going to paint back what's within the selection that you've made, similar to the clone. So I can be specific about deleting portions and then letting other portions remain. Does the layer mask idea make sense to everybody? It's very useful. It can get kind of complex as you start to get more intense images. But basically, I'm not actually deleting anything from this guy's hand. I'm just hiding it. OK. So I have our mask there. That's a pretty good mask. So I could say, all right, we want to merge those layers. If I were to merge this layer, the layer mask, I believe, will go away. It will convert the layer mask to, it will flatten it, basically. And it will make it a permanent part of the image. So I think I can unselect this. If I merge these together, it may not let me do that. See that if I merge it together, then the layer mask goes away, and I basically permanently deleted that information. So as soon as I combine multiple layers and a layer mask is there, it'll remove it from the file. So that's just something to keep in mind. Let's see here. And that's the basics of layer mask for now. That's fine. I want to try to take you guys through a few more commands here before we still have about an hour. Okay, that's good. All right, so what I want to do now is I want to take, let's take this guy, and I think it's okay that the wrench is gone, so we'll just merge all the layers. And let's move this guy to, I'm going to copy him over to my bird image. So I'm just using the same, we should rename this so that it's our own file. But I'm going to copy him into the bird image. Let's make a Photoshop file called wild drawing save that where you need to. You'll want to make sure that you save your save options, keep the layers on. Okay, so I'll copy this guy in. And notice that he's actually a little bit taller than maybe what we wanted for this arrangement of the image. We could do a couple things. We could resize him so that he kind of fits the workspace. We could also say, no, I actually want the canvas to be larger. So I can go to my image, canvas size, and I can change the canvas size itself to something that actually fits better what's going on in the scene. So we could say our height is, and in this case, this is still a pretty big canvas based on the resolution conversation that we were having earlier. And this is actually going to give us some issues later down the line because maybe not for a file of this size, it's still pretty small, but if you're working with a file this large, you just have to be mindful of how large the size of it is, how big the megabytes is. It can get pretty big pretty quickly if you start to get into a 24 by 36 canvas or a 36 by 48 canvas or something like that.
How did you move the guy from?
I just did a Control C, Control V. Yep.
How do you get him on a different layer?
So there's tabs at the top that show the different files. So did a Control C, went to this file, and just Control V, and it should bring him in as his own layer. Yeah. Did it not?
No, put it on the same layer as everything else.
Do you only have one layer?
No.
Let me just see real quick. Oh no, it's there. It's just in the group.
It's just because it's
Yeah, so you can pull him outside of the folder if you need to here. So, yes, he goes copied into our bird cutouts folder, but say we want him not to move around when we have our bird cutouts folder selected, right? So let's just drag him outside of the folder, just drag him to the bottom, and then he's outside, and now he's his own thing. The bird cutouts folder can be turned off if we need to. So this is turning into a comical scene here, but I assure you that it will be useful. So like I said, let's resize our canvas size to be, let's have it be 20 by 20. And you'll notice here that there's a couple other useful things. There's an anchor point for how the image resizes. Right now it's saying, all right, I'm going to resize the canvas from the center of the canvas. So I'm going to cut off aspects of the width of it, but I'm going to add to the height of it, but also from the center. But say you knew that you wanted the left or the right 2/3 of the image, but you knew that, say, this portion of the image you wanted cut off. You could change where the image cuts from. So you could say, all right, I want this side of the image to not be cut at all, and I want, basically, when I change the numbers here, they're going to start this as 0 and move this way, rather than here it's saying this is 0, I'm going to equally cut off 10 inches from this side, or rather, give 10 inches to this side and give 10 inches to this side. So it lets you be very specific about how the canvas gets created. So I'm going to say, okay, from the middle, though, that's fine. It says some of this will be cut. We should be able to resize it. It's okay. So notice that our birds have been cut off. I should be able to move them back into the scene. It's just outside of the frame, basically. So let's say I'm going to cancel my application of that movement. I'm just going to individually go into my bird cutouts folder, and I'm going to move my bird. I can type Control T to see where it is. And I'm just going to move him into the scene. I'm going to do the same thing with the bird number 3. I could right-click it, or I could go directly to it in the folder and move it here. And the same thing here. So just moving these around. Let's say that the bird is doing something like this. Actually, let's make our canvas a little bit taller. Canvas height, and we'll start it from the bottom this time because we know that we want it to go up. So let's say canvas height 30. Let's say this guy is reaching for the birds. So these birds are up here. Maybe he's even released this particular bird, so it's flying away from him. So maybe he's over here. And So let's do one additional thing here. Let's say this is a sort of childish reduction of the choreography, but it's just to show you some techniques. Let's say that the man has released the bird, and he's now sad, and he's going to sit down on a bench and be sad. Sad bench sitter. I wonder if that'll work. Huh. That's interesting. Boy, sad bench sitter really brings up all kinds of interesting things. The resolution on that's a little small, but that's maybe where I want to go with it. I'm actually okay with this one. Let's save this image. And again, this is just, there's a kind of a variance of sizes and colors. I'll save this to the Dropbox. Okay. I promise you this is going to get a little cooler in a minute. Okay, so now I'm going to open up, that should be on the Dropbox. Let's open up our gentleman sitting on a bench, and let's quickly cut out our bench. Again, it doesn't need to be super clean. And this poor fella, I think I'm gonna spare him from being in the image. Just work with this guy. Oh, and notice that I double-clicked there, and it completed the selection before I was done. That sometimes comes when if you've clicked a little too quickly as you're making your selection around. But again, we can just continue through. And I'm just holding down my shift now to add, and then I can just remove this part of the selection. Okay. All right, so we're now going to copy that selection that I made over to our kind of main file. If you're not seeing on the top tab here, because you've opened up a few different things, where your file is, you can just quickly cycle through multiple open files by clicking Control-Tab. We're back to our image here. So there's our bench man. So now that we've seen it here, let's maybe we do make our canvas size a little bit bigger. Our width maybe is 40. And we're going from the beginning to the end. Okay, so say there's a sequence of, again, the capturing of the frames of what you're doing in your selected choreography. Presumably will have a sequence of frames similar to the way that the base image of the birds was set up, or the base image of those people running was set up, right? You're going to have multiple sequential pieces of what you've put together. But maybe there is some abstraction between the beginning and the end that, like with the bacon images, you're teasing out with line work or with color or with a blurriness to some implied action or distortion of of 1 or 2 or 3 images rather than 25 or 30. So maybe there's a middle ground there where that makes sense. So I'm going to add this other side. I'm going to add this bench, this other side to the bench. I'm just going to copy that piece, call this bench, man. Again, I'm just copying, and now I can use my Control-T to resize and just kind of push them over and imply that the bench is complete on both sides for the sake of what we're doing this moment. Okay, so another thing I want to do here is I'm going to desaturate my Birdman. Call him Young Man. So I can desaturate him on the image itself by typing Control-U. And what that does is it brings up a hue saturation menu that I can adjust the hue or the saturation of the guy. I could also do this as a layer filter. So I could have him be in his own folder. And we could apply a filter inside of this folder. So the filters, global filters are here. Create new fill or adjustment layer. That's also what's getting shown up here. So I'm going to go in here and I'm going to use my hue saturation. And notice now that this is actually applied to everything below this, if I move this up to the top of the screen, everything below this, if I were to say the darkness changes, it's changing the darkness of everything. But if I were to move this down, it's only going to change the darkness of the things that are below it. So I could actually take this all the way down to my Young Man folder and just have it apply to just this guy. So in this particular case, lightness-wise, I don't want to do anything, but saturation-wise, I want to bring him down to black and white. So that's saturation down to -100.
How did you add that layer?
So you do the little this little half moon button here, and then it brings up this sub-menu of multiple different filters that you can apply. There's a hue saturation button within that. That's the one I used. So let's move. So kind of some simple Photoshop here. We will return to Photoshop momentarily, but I want to get us exposed to a couple other programs here. Or a couple other workflows with this. So let's click Save As. Let's both save it as a PSD, but also a Photoshop file. But let's also save this as a PNG file. We'll use that to do some work in, or it could be a JPEG as well. That actually doesn't matter. Let's save it as a JPEG. While drawing base JPEG. Fine. And what it's going to do is it's going to apply a white background to what we were looking at, just by default. So now I'm going to open up Rhino, and I'm going to delete some of this stuff that I made. Actually, you know what? I saved this already, so I saved this on the Dropbox already, so you can reference it later if you want to. But I'm just going to make a new file. File new. Do large objects inches. All right, so now I'm going to make what's called a picture frame in Rhino. I'm going to bring in my base drawing, while drawing base JPEG. I can size it to whatever size I want. And I'm going to actually rotate it up into, well, since it's just a flat drawing, we're just going to operate on this in plan. So for now.
Is there a picture frame command? Is that what you do?
Yeah, picture frame command, yep. So presumably with your documentation of yourself and your choreography, like we said, you're going to have a grid or a unit system that is recognizable to you in the image or in the video frames that you can extract, as whether it's the background or some frame of reference. So presumably we would be able to scale this image to be at scale if we needed to. But so for right now, let's say our friend here is 6 feet tall. roughly. And he's crouching a little bit, so maybe, maybe his 6 foot height is about there. So we'll scale this to about 6 feet using the reference similar to CAD. Actually, it's a little easier than CAD. It just lets you do it right away. 6 feet. Looks like we were close, so that's good. Okay, so my base image. Picture frame? Yep. So now what I want to do is actually highlight here a few things that we could also highlight with the bird drawing. I could bring the bird drawing in as well, just as a reference point. So we have our bird drawing in here. We have our weird collage narrative sequence. Young man letting bird go, turning into old man, that is sad. Okay, so let's say that I wanted to start to try to document, in addition to just the kind of optical documentation of the bird in flight and its frames, right? Or you bringing a spoon to your mouth or jumping over a rock or something. What's the framework for that image, right? What's the baseline? What are these like latent variables that could be within the drawing that you're trying to tease out? So let's say that we want to talk about the trajectory of the bird itself. Maybe we highlight a couple basic kind of skeletal points of the bird. Let's say the end of it's just using a line. In fact, I'm going to use a line that is red. Diagram skeleton. So let's say that I have some base points for the bird. Maybe there's kind of, it follows the trajectory of its wing. But I also, maybe I want this to be, maybe it is just about the bird's wing. So maybe it's just this set of 2 lines. So let's say then that I do that same kind of documentation of where the bird's wing as a double line is here. And then let's say I do it as here as well. It almost looks like it's a little bit inverted. So now let's say that I want to create some interstitial analysis of the bird getting from this point in its flight to this point. We obviously have our our photographic trajectory of the bird and its wings flapping and how things are moving. But maybe there's some additional, again, layers of movement or flow or a distortion of the grid that you've measured that you want to, or flow of energy or something that you want to highlight in an interesting way. So we can do this a couple ways. Let's select our 2, here I'm going to lock my base image so that I don't keep selecting it. I'm going to select my 2 lines here. I'm going to type tween curves. So what this does is it actually will extrapolate a sequence of steps between 2 objects and try to blend them together depending on the number of steps that I've made. So I could say, all right, in this case it's 1 step, there's 1 line there. But let's say that I want this to be 100 steps. It has taken the vertices of the line, and I'm going to press enter, and it has pulled this line to become in the orientation of this line over that sequence of 100 steps, right? So now, yeah. So this is tween curves. They're not quite grown-ups yet. It's fine. So basically, correct. And so another thing that you can do is you can, the match method, actually let's keep it as none. Let's say that you actually wanted this, for whatever reason you wanted this, just like the loft command, you want this vertices to read actually as this one, even though we know that that's the end of our bird's wing, so that actually is doing it correctly. And there's an implication there of kind of a flapping movement, right? Like it's reductive compared to what we actually see here. But there's something interesting about that translation, right? We could also, maybe knowing what was happening in the image down here with the bird, we could quickly highlight those things here, knowing a few more points, and always starting maybe at the bird's body and having the second point be or the third point rather, be the bird's outstretched wing. We could get a very quick so you get the idea here, but let's just complete the task of it. So I'm going to tween, in this particular case, I'm going to tween between each of these a few times. So let's say 25 times in each case. I'm going to select, press enter to accept options. So now I actually need to select the curves. So I'll do tween again.
It's only giving me one mark.
Yeah, so you got to do the number. You got to change that number to whatever your interval is. Yep. So in this case, I do 25. And then let's say I choose these two curves and I do 25 again. And I can do the same here. And again. And you're starting to get a sense of maybe the implied dynamism of the bird's wings. Flapping through space. Does everybody follow how to do that? So that, I think, is kind of a cool extraction of information that you've curated yourself based on some simple points and lines drawn on the image. You could then go back in, if you were a little bit more organized with it, let's say. Let me go back here. Let's say that the tweened lines are on a different layer altogether. If we did that operation again. Oh, so by default, it looks like the tweened lines will be the same layered lines as what your baselines were. So we need to be a little bit deliberate about this. What I want to do is highlight like the baseline frames around which some of this other stuff is getting blended through. So why don't we just make a copy of these? We could group these, copy them, and I'll just make I'll make one of those groups the tween lines. And then I can hide the skeleton diagram for now. We'll ungroup this. And then again, we can go back through and do our tween operation. So that's one aspect that we're going to do a little bit more with in a minute here. So we want to be able to compile all these things together. So we have our kind of documentation of movement, which is interesting. We have, let's say that there are, again, like just the act of kind of diagramming the moments that are within the collage that we made here. Let's say for the person it's a little bit more complicated. You know, we have their arms. Maybe there's actually a couple lines that we recognize that are doing certain types of movement. So we have a kind of the general joints in the feet. We do that for both sides. And maybe there's some parallel. And in this particular case, again, you presumably would have more frames, but maybe there's some implication, filling in the gaps here from our seated man to our standing man with a simple set of lines. So again, kind of trying to mimic so that we know where the endpoints of these lines are, where the shoulder, kind of drawing it in the same order as we drew our first set of lines. I'm just going through, drawing basically from hand, to hand to toe. So we have our kind of seated person and our stretched out person, right? But maybe at this point, I'm going to turn my points on. Again, your documentation of this will be more robust, I would imagine, because you'll have additional frames of you doing things. But say that there's, again, an additional overlay of alternate movement, or someone was outside of the frame that you want to somehow bring in how they were moving against what you were documenting on the camera, and the interaction of those two things. So using your kind of analytical powers and a little bit of artistic license for, what did this guy do after he put his arms down? Maybe there's some middle point that gets him over to the old man. F10. Do F10 for points on. You can also type points on. Points on. That's an easier way to do it. And again, I'm just selecting points and kind of simply reorienting them, just to give us a sense of some of this blend. So let's say that I'm tween. And in this case, maybe I have my left and my right side. And maybe there's one for the other side too. And in this case, maybe those want to be a different layer or something like that, so that you can see the overlay of them. Let's say that that's left side. And this is right side. Whatever that one was. Call it there too for a second, but we'll call it right side. There's our right side. Okay. And maybe the interval changes. Maybe the tween interval in this case is 40. There's some implication of difference or movement. So turn these things off, and obviously, maybe the trajectory of the bird path is also captured in a line or something like that. And these things then are back set against a measurable grid that either you could tease out as actual line work that you bring into the space, right? That you could say, okay, I have my, this is 20 feet. You can kind of set up like, okay, if we want to measure how high the bird went, every foot we can make an array if we wanted to, or copy these over. You could remake your grid so that it actually is measurable. This is a very analog way to do this, but let's say that's our grid. Let's make that like a light gray. And say there's maybe, again, this is hopefully related to photographic setup that you've already created. So some of this will be a tracing operation, and then of course some of it maybe would be more of a kind of a curatorial or a creative operation, that maybe it's not stuff that's exactly there. Obviously the dynamism of that bird flapping is much less interesting, I think, than this, so why don't we move that up? And again, we're just kind of playing around here a little bit, but it just gives you an idea of how you can start to map some of the movements of these items. So then what I think is important is kind of recompiling this information in another program, Illustrator, for example. So let's say that we, let's just quickly return to Photoshop first. Let's actually, I'm going to save each of these elements as their own, maybe as their own object. I can crop this if I want to. I could just crop this guy out. The crop button is the little button below the magic wand. I could save him then as its own, as a PNG that's background, that doesn't have a background then. So this is important actually, where man on bench, if you save as a PNG, there's no background to it. So, or you can have it, you can choose to have no background to it. So what that will let us do is bring that object into Illustrator without there being a white area around it. So cutouts. That's fine. I'll just undo this real quick to maybe just do the same operation with our other characters here. So the beginning of that Photoshop exercise was kind of to show how to manipulate existing frames or photographs, cut out things, clone things, filter things a little bit. The composition that we ultimately created was a little bit farcical. But then obviously once we get into Rhino, we can start to overlay vector information over it in a way that's interesting. Let's say JPEG, I'm sorry, let's say PNG, young man. What time do we have? What time is it? 3? Okay. Okay. And in this particular case, I think the actual, the base image of the birds was more interesting than the birds that we ended up cutting out ultimately. But let's keep those birds. Let's just keep them for a second. I want to do something with them. Let's just highlight our first bird. And we'll cut him out. All right, and again, we're taking different pieces and we'll be reassembling them kind of in a collage format in Illustrator. Why am I not seeing PNG? There it is. Okay, close that. We'll go back here. Okay, so now what I want to do is, we've cut some things out in Illustrator. We have set up some line work from Rhino. I've saved a couple of the cutouts here. Let's reassemble some of this stuff in Illustrator. So first I want to go back to Rhino and export this line work. Maybe I'll do one more thing here. Just make my grid. This is every foot as well. So in this case, I could just do an array. Say 0 in the X direction, or 1 rather. Maybe there's 15, sure, in the Y direction, 1 in the Z, and then it should let me space these out as I want to in a quicker way than just copying single line over and over again. That's what I was doing earlier, is arraying those verticals. So I just want to get a reference point for kind of our measuring once we get into Illustrator. So again, I'm doing this a little bit messily, but let's say that this is grid. Great. We have our, maybe we say this is flight line. And notice there that it didn't actually change the name. I was inside of another command while I was trying to change the name. That's why I got confused. So, but it did change the layer. So, all right. So we have our right side legs. We have our left side. Between lines in general, I think we have a good sense of. Okay, so I'll just hide the base image here as it was just a reference. And just to complete our overlay here, let's just even that out a little bit. There's our ground line. So another thing to consider once you guys are in, when you're making your own drawings, I think it does reference this on the brief, but sorry, I keep typing, this has happened in other classes too. I keep typing my shortcuts for the program, and they're obviously not in there, so apologies for that. What was I going to say? Lost my train of thought.
Nothing on the brief.
Oh, reference on the brief. Yes. The reference on the brief, it talks about the length or the size of the drawing that you might consider, and that it might be appropriate to have a 50-foot long drawing that's only a foot tall, or something that's really tall that's not super wide. Like, consider that format. It's that this particular drawing, I think, will probably be more successful if there is some strange dimensionality or proportion to it, especially if there's an extensive amount of movement or something that takes place over a long amount of time. And documentation of time could happen with multiple frames or with, again, a lengthier kind of description or documentation of what we're showing here. But let's say I export this now as make 2D line work. I'll also just put this onto the Dropbox real quick if you guys want to use it to reference. All right, so that should be in that references folder. All right, now we'll go into InDesign. I'm sorry, Illustrator. So the beauty of this drawing versus some other drawings that we've talked about in the past when we've imported stuff into here is, this is, I don't know if this has come up yet in some of the reviews that you've had, orientation as it relates to scale, measurement, and the compass direction. I know you guys have just kind of worked with these abstract landscapes that don't maybe yet have a directionality that's meaningful, but a north arrow, a scale that lets you, as an outside person that didn't make the drawing, understand very quickly what the distance of the drawing is, what the scale of the drawing is, very important. So there are conventional scales, obviously, within architectural drawing that people are expecting for certain types of drawings. That's not always the one that you have to use. The beauty of a drawing like this is that we know that our grid is a foot by a foot. So we have a visual register that we can scale this to anything we want, and we know, as long as we notate it properly, that visual register will be intact. And so it allows you to have a little bit more freedom with how you lay out the drawing because you have a dimensional reference point. So I'm going to just change my artboard. In this particular case, the length of this drawing is not going to be particularly dynamic, as we were talking about with the assignment numbers, but we'll just have it be on an 11 by 17 for now for simplicity. I'm just going to size it so that it's not fully on the page, because I might want to annotate things afterwards that fill up the outer portions of the space, or maybe I want to title it differently or add it to another set of drawings. Okay, so this just becomes a little bit of a line work exercise, but before we do that, these all should be on their own layers. That's great. So let's add a layer for base image, or let's say collage imagery. Okay. I'm going to put that at the bottom so that my line work is on top of it. So now what I can do is I can place imagery into this file. So I could choose my various cutouts that I made, young man, place. And so now I can move him, resize him, so that he's roughly in the position of his original body. I can use my arrow keys on the keyboard to kind of nudge where he is in space. And maybe he's a little bit taller or shorter than that, but that's okay for now. We'll adjust our line work here shortly to let him be seen a little bit better, but I think that gives us a sense of it. Let's also place man on bench. We'll resize him accordingly as well. Notice he went into the grid, so we'll put him on collage image, make sure he's there. Again, I'm just kind of eyeballing this, but you should be able to, with the right relationship to the grid and to your dynamic kind of analysis, resize these roughly as you need to. So let's now bring in our bird. We'll just put him up here for now because we're going to use him in a little different way. Now I want to do one more thing. I want to place that original base image of the birds in flight, the cutout in the array file. So this is a much larger image, as you can see. I will resize him firstly to get it down to fit kind of what we showed here. We could, again, kind of roughly line up where the birds are. Just for that's about right for now. That's fine. So now we don't want the rest of that image though. So we can actually clip this image. We can create a clipping mask. I'm just going to close off this other information so I can see for a second. I'm going to draw a box that is doesn't have any fill in it. I'm going to draw a box around the area of the birds that I want to see still. And actually, I can make that, the whole box can be invisible. It's just for our own visual register to see what I'm doing here. But let's say, so I've drawn this box around the area that I want to be shown. I select that box, and I hold Shift and I select the image itself, and then I type Control-7, and it does an image clip for that area.
Draw the box.
So you'd basically draw the box or the shape. I could draw a very specific shape if I wanted to. Let's undo that real quick. I could say, all right, I actually want my shape to be this. Maybe I don't want those lines to be there, so I'll make it invisible, but the shape's there, right? So I could say that, select that, and then type Control-7, and it's just going to choose, yep, Control-7. So just like in InDesign and other frame kind of related programs, you can slide around the image within the context of that frame. So it's like cut out a little window on the page, and this was what's underneath. So again, you can position things over other things very quickly, which is pretty cool. So I'm just going to go back to that box that I had because I think it's a little cleaner. All right, so we have some cutouts. We have some line work. We have a bird here that is different. We're going to do something different with that guy in a minute, so actually let's just leave him up there. Okay, so again, I'm not going to spend too much on this because we've already looked at it, but the tween lines, maybe those are a little bit lighter. Maybe they're like a lightish gray. And the line weight of that is, something much, much lighter than what we had before. Say maybe the grid itself is also quite light. Or maybe it's even a dotted line, just to imply, kind of the distance of things. So I'll say 0.15-1. So you start to kind of see this relationship of the line work maybe that, again, like the relationship between left and right side of his body, for some reason, maybe there's something important about that. So I could select that line weight, and let's maybe make that red. Again, the line weight is, the line work is a little heavy, so let's lighten that. Left side. Let's lighten that to like 0.25. But what I want to do actually is, let's say, this one, and this one are a little bit heavier to show like the points of reference or something like that, right? And let's say that I want the same thing to be true for these ones here. And maybe each of those lines have the purplish line weight to them, or a purple line weight. And then maybe these ones so that they're highlighted kind of above everything else. Though that particular line work goes to another layer or something, or goes to the top, like skeletal highlights or something. Move that up so that it makes sure that it's on top of everything else. Looks like we need to move it up one more. So again, just kind of working with your layers, working with your layer management. We could start to add, we could add some text metrics to this, like we can do it in Illustrator. You can also do it in InDesign, but I think I'm not going to be able to get to InDesign right now. So let's say Arial 0 feet. So if you know your interval if the interval in InDesign or in Illustrator is the same, you can copy objects up at the same interval and have it, here, I'm holding down Alt-Shift as I do this to drag it and copy it. And then I can actually type Control-D and it will just copy it continually at that same interval. So notice that I was a little off in my spacing because obviously the 1 foot line is right. So this is just giving you an idea that, this is 10 feet or whatever it is. Maybe these lines are not in between, but just starting to add some measurement to the scene. So that's actually 10. And again, I think the hierarchy of line work applies to the way that you're measuring as well. So, in the base image, the birds, like old technology, like fine. That's it's the graph paper or whatever was on the wall. Even within that, though, there's sort of major and minor axes are called out with some different line work, different line weights. So it's probably worth us, here, maybe at 10 and 20 and 0 or something like that, like highlighting that to be a little bit heavier, right? Maybe the dashed line is a little bit more intense there or something, so that you can start to read that better. Maybe this line, maybe this collage is actually below the grid, so that you can still see so you can still see the line work over the top of it. And we could continue to go through here and adjust lines, adjust line weights, and so another element of what we could do is I could trace any of these images. I could draw line work over the image itself to highlight a certain, just using my pen tool and the control points. highlight different elements of, again, maybe this particular frame of the bird flying was something that was important. And remember from before, we can go to our appearance, our attributes menu. We could change our fill to 25% or something like that. And then maybe that gets pulled out or something. Maybe that level of analysis is up here and denoting, some different pattern between, like, okay, the bird's velocity between here and here was calculated at X, but whatever it might be. And then between here and here, it was something else. So I think that there's layers to the drawing that you can make just with kind of a combination of line work, photo collage, and then being, clean and clear with your reference grid. So another thing, I think, just briefly going back to Photoshop, I think, there's some interesting things going on in this type of drawing. And dynamism, passage of time and movement, et cetera, but also the more abstract feeling of the Bacon images, like this intense overlay of information. I think it's not quite doing that yet. The line work, I think, is helping. I think that's starting to document it in an interesting way, but I wonder if there's still something that we could go back to in this image that we could figure out a way to highlight in a better way. Like maybe there's something about our friend here who he's very upset, and we want to highlight his anger through some movement of his head or something like that. We could isolate. His head, and we could distort it or blur it or do something to it that would give an implication of emotion or something like that. Again, just using some of the simple commands that we had from earlier. We could rotate this around. We could stretch this out. Again, I don't know what this means, but
How do you do the distorted?
so the Control T, and then you can stretch things as you need to. And then you could go up and you could blur, filter in the filter menu. You could blur things. You could say like maybe there's a motion blur to this. That's really intense. And then that actually has some transparency to it that shows a level of movement or something to the guy. Or maybe it's even creepier than that. Maybe it's warped in such a way, or we color it in such a way. It's all black and white, so that's tough to do. But we could go up to Edit, Transform, and there's different ways to transform the image that I just did. So the Control T is the kind of base shape transform, but you can also you can warp and distort and skew things in really interesting ways. So if I use the warp one, I actually have a series of kind of control points that allow me to be sinuous and almost ghost-like with the way that some of this information would get pulled away from his face. Maybe that his soul is rushing out of his body, who knows? And yeah, there's a ghost face or something like that we could. Oh my God. This is comical at this point, but you get the idea. I could bring that in. But again, so actually, this does bring up a more serious point. I'm not asking you to go get a Scream head and bring it into Photoshop necessarily, but when distorted in the right way, the imagery can, we could blur this, or we could warp this to imply something else that's going on, right? So, and then maybe if we blur it enough and abstract it enough, he's just really sad about that damn bird. I don't know. We could erase the edges maybe a little bit, right? Like if we give this a blur. We can do motion blur again, or we could do, I don't know, something like that, right? So suddenly it's kind of terrifying and weird. But the idea, I think, is that you can, with a combination of the discrete measuring tools that you'll use to document yourself, and line work that is scalable and referenceable, and you can change the line weights of, and apply a grid to, and have a sense of measurement. You can also add these kind of additional variables of emotion and dynamism, time, movement, etc. that the raster image Photoshop kind of exercise can help add to, right? And then compile it all in Illustrator or in InDesign and make a cool drawing out of it. So I encourage you to look up some of Bacon's work, and check out some more of these chronophotography images, because I think it's helpful just to see how even the more scientific ones are kind of creepy, right? Because it backgrounds the person and it foregrounds the measuring system, and I think that's the key to making this drawing work for you guys.